Hello, everyone, and welcome to 7 Continents, One Story.
Hi there. So glad you're joining us today.
Hey everyone, great to have you here.
I'm Niels, professor of history from Sweden.
I'm Celine, joining you from Edinburgh, Scotland.
And I'm Ethan, calling in from Malta.
Together, we explore incredible stories from history across all 7 continents.
Every episode brings you a new journey through time.
From ancient civilizations to modern moments that changed everything.
So let's begin.
All right, Nils. I have something that might stump you for once.
Celine, you know that won't happen. Go on.
Ooh, is this the Artefact game? I love this.
Okay, here is my challenge. I'll describe an object. If you can identify it in 2 clues instead of 3, I'll buy your coffee for a month.
You're on. But when I win with 1 clue, you're buying for 2 months.
What is it, Celine? Come on.
All right. This object was raised in the air by desperate people on the night of 29th of November, 1854. It was handmade, and it was a promise to stand together no matter what.
That's actually quite mysterious. I'm not sure I know this one.
Want another clue?
Please.
It became so powerful that it's still used today to represent resistance to injustice, and I actually have a replica hanging in my flat in Edinburgh.
Oh, I think I might know. This is about the Australian rebellion, isn't it? The Eureka Stockade.
Wait, Australia had a rebellion, like an actual armed uprising?
Ethan, that's the beautiful part. It's the only one Australia had, and it changed everything.
Let me describe this object carefully. It's fabric, blue fabric actually, roughly 1.5 meters square. Someone stitched it by hand.
Mm-hmm.
The detail work is extraordinary. Across the surface, 5 white stars are arranged in a pattern you can see in the night sky. And there's a white cross superimposed over those stars. Just a simple, powerful combination of shapes.
It sounds almost sacred.
That's exactly what it was to the people who made it and raised it.
Where was it from?
That's the mystery we're going to solve today.
Let me take you there. The year is 1854. Not so long ago, really. Only about 170 years. You're in southeastern Australia, in a place called Ballarat, in the state of Victoria. It's dawn on the 3rd of December, and you're standing among mostly ordinary men. Miners, diggers, people from all over the world. Ireland, Wales, Italy, Germany, China.
All together in Australia?
All together, and they're about to change how the world thinks about democracy. Some of them won't survive the next few hours, but the ones that do, they'll have won something far more valuable than gold. To understand why miners in Australia would risk their lives for political rights, we need to step back just a few years. The year is 1851. A man named Thomas Peters discovers gold in a place called Specimen Gully. When word spreads, it spreads like wildfire.
Wait, Australia has gold? I didn't know that.
Neither did anyone else, Ethan, and that's the point.
Exactly. Within months, we're talking a matter of weeks. Really, tens of thousands of people arrive. Victoria's population goes from about 76,000 to over 300,000 in just a few years.
That's insane. That's like the population almost quintupled.
Quintupled. Exactly. And Ballarat goes from a small settlement to a city of 25,000 people, all searching for gold, all hoping to strike it rich.
It reminds me of how Edinburgh transformed during different periods of history. Sudden population surges change everything. The governance, the social structures, the tensions.
And that's where our story really begins. Because the Victorian colonial government saw this gold rush one way, as revenue. They imposed a licensing system. Every digger had to pay £1 per month, not per ounce of gold they found per month, regardless of whether they discovered anything.
So if you didn't find any gold that month, you still had to pay?
You still had to pay. £1 was a substantial sum in 1854. For a digger who hadn't found anything, it could represent their entire savings.
I came across accounts in the library about how these licensing fees worked in other colonies, but the enforcement in Ballarat was particularly brutal.
The Gold Commissioner, a man named Robert Reed, he ordered police to conduct license hunts, surprise raids.
Surprise raids where police would sweep through the diggings, checking licenses, and if they found someone without one, they had a warrant to arrest them. These weren't gentle, lawful procedures. Diggers reported beatings, intimidation, corruption.
Corruption? Like the police were taking bribes?
Widespread corruption. And the colonial government either didn't know or didn't care.
But it wasn't just the licensing system that sparked the rebellion.
There was a catalyst, a moment where anger transformed into action. On the night of the 6th of October, 1854, a Scottish digger named James Scobie was killed outside a pub called the Eureka Hotel. He got into a confrontation with the proprietor, a man named James Bentley, and Bentley beat him to death.
Just killed him?
Just killed him. And here's where it gets worse. There was an inquest. Bentley was acquitted, no conviction. The diggers, they were furious. A judicial inquiry was held. Bentley was acquitted again.
Acquitted twice?
Because Bentley had connections. He knew the magistrate, he had status, and real justice, wasn't available to ordinary miners.
So they burned the hotel?
On the 17th of October, about 10,000 diggers gathered outside the Eureka Hotel. They were filled with rage at this absolute perversion of justice. They torched the building, set it on fire.
And that's when things escalated.
That's when everything accelerated. The government's response was to arrest diggers suspected of arson and prosecute them. Instead of addressing the underlying injustice, Scobie's death, the corruption, they chose confrontation. Now, this is where we need to meet one of the crucial figures in our story, a man named John Basson Humphrey. John was Welsh, a law clerk, and a committed political activist. He'd been involved in something called the Chartist movement back in Britain.
The Chartist movement? What's that?
A social movement, wasn't it? Fighting for workers' rights and democratic representation?
Perfect, Celine, exactly. The Chartists demanded universal male suffrage, secret ballot voting, and other democratic reforms. John Basson Humphrey believed in those principles deeply, and he saw something in the miners' grievances. On the 11th of November, 1854, Humphrey convened a mass meeting at a place called Bakery Hill. 10,000 miners attended, and from that meeting emerged the Ballarat Reform League. It was Humphrey who wrote their charter, their statement of principles.
What did the charter say?
And I'm quoting here, "It is the inalienable right of every citizen to have a voice in making the laws he is called upon to obey." And then it says, "Taxation without representation is tyranny."
That sounds like American revolutionary language.
It is. The miners, these weren't uneducated people, despite what authorities sometimes claimed. They were political thinkers. They had absorbed ideas from revolutionary movements across Europe and America. They understood political philosophy.
So they weren't just angry about gold licenses?
No. Ethan, that's the crucial point. Yes, the license system was oppressive. Yes, the corruption was infuriating. But what they were really fighting for was democratic representation. They wanted a voice in the laws that governed them.
Taxation without representation.
Exactly. Governor Hotham, who'd arrived just a few months earlier in June, he didn't see reform as an option. He saw the uprising as rebellion that needed suppressing. When the mass meeting occurred on the 29th of November, Governor Hotham issued orders. Police should intensify their license hunts.
On the same day as the meeting?
The very next day, on the 30th of November.
So the miners had gathered peacefully, and the government responded with force.
Responded with force. The miners had raised a flag, this flag, the Southern Cross, and sworn an oath. They swore an oath that said, I'm paraphrasing, but they promised to stand together to defend their rights and liberties. They were making a commitment to one another.
This is where it becomes armed rebellion?
This is where words transform into action. This flag I mentioned, the Southern Cross flag, it's the object Celine challenged me to identify. And the remarkable thing is, who made it?
Who made it?
3 women. Or actually, at least 3 women we know about. Names like Anastasia Hayes, Anastasia Withers, and a woman named Anne Duke. Anne was heavily pregnant.
They made it while pregnant? While the conflict was happening?
They made it in a Catholic church tent. In the days before the rebellion. It was handmade, stitched by hand. And it became the symbol of the miners' unity and commitment to each other.
So it wasn't just a flag. It was a physical manifestation of their solidarity.
It was a physical manifestation. And when I examined a replica of it in my collection, and yes, I do have a replica, brought back from the Eureka Center in Ballarat, I was struck by how carefully it was constructed. The stitching, the precision. These women weren't casually making a banner. They were creating something sacred.
So who were these women? Are they remembered?
That's a question historians are only now starting to answer properly. For over 100 years, they were forgotten. The uprising was remembered as a male rebellion. But women were there. They participated. They fought. And some of them died.
They died during the conflict?
We know at least one woman was killed. Her name is unknown. She was shot by mounted police as she tried to help her wounded husband. She's commemorated on the memorial at Eureka, but her name was lost to history. After the police raid on the 30th of November, the miners knew there would be retaliation. They made a decision. They would march to the Eureka diggings, a specific area of the mining fields, and they would fortify it.
Fortify it? Like build a defensive position?
Like build a defensive position. But remember, these were miners, not soldiers. The fortification they constructed was hastily built. They used pit props, wooden supports from the mines, and overturned horse carts. They threw together whatever they could find.
That doesn't sound very strong.
It wasn't. Military engineers would have immediately identified its weaknesses. But it was something. It was a line, a place to make a stand.
Approximately how many miners gathered there?
Initial reports suggest between 500 and 1,500 participated in the march. By December 2nd, when the stockade was more fully formed, perhaps 300 to 400 were actually present in and around the fortification. Many others came and went, dropping off supplies, offering support, then leaving.
They brought supplies?
They brought supplies. Women brought food. They brought ammunition. Well, whatever ammunition could be gathered. People risked their safety to support those defending the stockade.
It sounds like a genuine community uprising. Not just a few hotheads, but actual collective action.
Exactly. And that's crucial to understanding what happened. This was a community deciding together that something had to change. But Governor Hotham had made his decision. He saw the stockade as sedition, armed rebellion against Crown authority. He ordered military action.
What kind of military action?
On the 2nd of December, Hotham ordered approximately 276 soldiers and police to prepare to assault the stockade at dawn on December 3rd.
276 military? Against how many miners?
Against perhaps 150 miners who were actually present when the assault began. Many had left overnight, fearing what was coming.
They knew an attack was coming?
They suspected, but they couldn't be certain. And even if they had been, many believed they could defend the position, or perhaps more importantly, they believed the principle was worth the risk.
You mentioned that Peter Lalor was the miners' leader during the assault. Tell us about him.
Peter Lalor, born in Ireland, in a place called Tinnakill, County Laois, on the 5th of February, 1827. He was educated at a college called Carlow College, and he trained as a civil engineer.
He was an engineer?
An engineer. He migrated to Australia in 1852, initially working on the Melbourne to Geelong Railway. He arrived at Eureka in 1853, so he was relatively new to the diggings when the uprising occurred.
So he wasn't a long-time mining activist?
That's what makes Lalor so fascinating. He wasn't a revolutionary by temperament. He was a thoughtful, educated man who had become involved in the Ballarat Reform League. But he remained relatively in the background until November 30th, when the government's response to the peacefully assembled miners became violent. On that day, November 30th, when approximately 1,500 miners gathered and the police attempted another license hunt, Lalor was present. He was asked to lead them. Not because he had military experience, he didn't, but because he possessed intelligence and organizational ability. The miners recognized those qualities and selected him as their commander.
Just like that, they elected a leader during a crisis?
In a sense, yes, and Lalor accepted the responsibility. He led them to the Eureka diggings, and there they began constructing the stockade. For 3 days, the miners waited. 3 days of tension. 3 days of wondering if what they were doing would actually change anything, or if they were simply walking toward their own deaths.
How were people feeling during those 3 days?
From eyewitness accounts, and we have remarkable accounts from people like an Italian miner named Raffaello Carboni. We know there was fear, certainly, but also determination. There was actually singing. There were moments of camaraderie. People wrote letters to family members saying goodbye in case they didn't survive.
They actually thought they might die?
They knew they might. The military force was significantly larger and infinitely better armed and trained. The stockade's defensive position was modest at best. And yet, people chose to stay.
Why, if they knew the odds were so poor?
Because sometimes, and this is what makes humanity remarkable, sometimes people decide that certain principles matter more than their own safety. The right to democratic representation, the right to justice, the right to be treated as human beings, not as subjects to be exploited. 3:30 in the morning, December 3rd, 1854.
Very early.
Very early. The government forces were led by a man named Captain John Wellesley Thomas. Thomas was an experienced military officer. He'd served in Afghanistan during the First Afghan War. He'd been wounded at a place called Maharajpuri. He knew warfare.
So the government sent professional soldiers against miners?
Professional soldiers against miners. The force included detachments from the 49th Regiment Somersetshire and the 12th Regiment East Suffolk, regular British Army units. They were under strict discipline. They marched in silence.
They marched to the stockade in silence?
In silence. Captain Thomas wanted surprise and discipline. Before they marched, he distributed rum, a traditional tot given to soldiers before combat. Not to intoxicate them, but to settle nerves and build camaraderie.
How do we know these details?
From accounts written by soldiers themselves, from Raffaello Carboni's memoir, from people who witnessed it or participated, history records what happened, even when some would prefer it be forgotten. The assault began with a multi-directional attack. Thomas was tactically sophisticated. He didn't send a frontal charge at the stockade's strongest point. Instead, he calculated that if defenders fired downhill in darkness, they would likely fire high, their bullets passing over the heads of advancing soldiers.
That's military thinking.
Military thinking. Mounted police swept around the stockade's flanks to prevent escape. The main assault force advanced in skirmishing formation. That's a spread-out line, maximizing firepower while presenting a smaller target.
What happened when the miners saw them?
When the soldiers were about 300 yards away, the miners opened fire. Gunshots rang out across the Eureka lead, and Captain Thomas, he heard the gunfire, and he sounded the charge. The battle lasted approximately 15 minutes. 15 minutes that would echo through Australian history.
15 minutes? The whole battle?
15 minutes of intense combat. And it was genuine combat. Historical analysis by military historians suggests the miners' fire was actually effective. The 49th Regiment, Thomas's own unit, wavered under that fire. They had to be rallied.
The miners actually held their own?
For those initial minutes, yes. Raffaello Carboni's account describes sharp shooting by the rebels, miners using their firearms effectively. It wasn't a one-sided massacre initially.
But then
the soldiers' superior discipline and training took over. They breached the stockade's perimeter. And what followed was brutal.
How brutal?
Mounted police, soldiers on horseback, rode through the mining encampment. Eyewitness accounts describe them using their saber swords against miners, against women. The unnamed woman I mentioned earlier, she was struck down trying to protect her wounded husband.
her name was lost?
Her name was lost. She died in the chaos, and officially, she was erased from the records. But she was there. She fought. She died for principles she believed in. Her contribution matters, even if history forgot her name.
Did Peter Lalor survive?
Lalor was among the first casualties. Early in the assault, a police constable named Michael Lalor fired at him. The bullet struck Lalor in the shoulder with tremendous force. The wound was so severe that surgeons later had to amputate his arm at the elbow.
He lost his arm?
He lost his arm. Peter Lalor lived for another 34 years with only one arm, a permanent physical testament to that dawn in December 1854.
He must have been in incredible pain.
He was, but Lalor escaped immediate capture. He remained hidden for weeks until the general amnesty was declared in May. When he emerged, his sacrifice, his lost arm, had made him a symbol. History would remember him as the face of Eureka. Official figures record 22 miners and 5 soldiers killed. However, historians believe the actual numbers were likely higher. Some miners fled into the bush and died from wounds days later. Some were never recorded officially. The death toll remains uncertain, but we know it was substantial.
And the miners were arrested?
113 miners were arrested immediately following the assault. 13 of them were identified as leaders and charged with high treason. The government believed that prosecuting the leaders for the most serious crime would serve as a warning to others.
High treason, that's a death sentence charge.
That's a death sentence charge, and that's where something remarkable happened. The Eureka flag, which had been raised on the 29th of November, was captured by police during the assault. It was taken as evidence of sedition and rebellion, but that flag, that handmade banner stitched by 3 pregnant women and ordinary miners, it survived.
It survived the battle?
It survived the battle. It was recovered and preserved. Today, it resides in the National Museum of Australia. I've seen it, actually stood in front of it, and I want to tell you, even behind protective glass, even after 170 years, you can feel its power.
Feel its power?
Feel its power, because that flag meant something. It wasn't just cloth and dye. It represented a moment when ordinary people said, "We matter. Our voices matter. Our rights matter. We will not be treated as subjects of a distant authority. We will stand together."
And the flag survived when so much else didn't.
And the flag survived. It became the symbol of Australian democracy, even though democracy came later. Today, when people protest injustice in Australia, when workers march for their rights, when citizens challenge government authority, they often carry the Eureka flag. It's become an enduring symbol of resistance, solidarity, and democratic aspiration.
So the flag didn't die on December 3rd?
No, Ethan, the flag didn't die. It was reborn. Now, here's where history becomes a moment of genuine choice. December 3rd, 1854. The battle has been brief. The stockade has been overrun. 113 miners have been arrested.
And what would normally happen?
Normally, after a failed rebellion, punishment follows. The authorities would consolidate power. They'd prosecute the leaders harshly. They'd make examples. They'd attempt to crush any future resistance.
So what actually happened?
That's the moment we need to examine. Governor Hotham faces a choice. No, actually, multiple choices. And each choice creates different futures. It's December 4th, 1854. Governor Hotham receives reports of the assault's results. 22 miners dead. His military forces have overwhelmed the rebellion. Militarily, he's succeeded.
But politically?
But politically, something unexpected is happening. In Melbourne, the capital city, 2 hours away, public opinion is turning. The newspapers are reporting on the assault. People are questioning why military force was used against miners. Why were ordinary people being prosecuted for treason when their real crime was asking for democratic representation?
So public opinion was turning against the government?
Turning against the government, yes. And Hotham must make a decision. Does he double down? Does he execute the 14 leaders? Does he maintain strict martial law and crush any possibility of future resistance? Or does he attempt reconciliation?
What would you do if you were Governor Hotham?
I wouldn't have used military force in the first place. I would have just listened to what the miners were asking for and reformed the licensing system.
Hindsight, Ethan. That's always clearer. But Hotham, he didn't see it that way. He saw miners gathering with weapons as rebellion. So he acted as if it were rebellion.
But by December 4th, the battle was over. At that point, Hotham had a choice: double down or change course.
If I were Hotham in that moment, I think I would have attempted reconciliation. Here's why. The government had already appointed a Royal Commission of Inquiry into Goldfields' administration before the assault even occurred. It was appointed on November 19th, specifically to investigate miners' grievances.
So there was already a process in place?
Already a process in place. Hotham could have said, "Look, the commission is investigating. Let's allow that process to proceed. Let's see what recommendations emerge, and let's refrain from executing the miners' leaders, which would only generate more anger and resentment."
But couldn't he argue that executing them would prevent future rebellions, like show people that rebellion has consequences?
That's the authoritarian argument, Ethan. Yes, executing leaders can be a deterrent, but it often backfires. It creates martyrs. It galvanizes opposition. And Hotham had a precedent to be aware of.
What precedent?
The Chartist movement in Britain. The government had suppressed Chartist uprisings harshly. They executed some leaders. And what happened? Public support for the Chartist cause actually grew. People saw them as martyrs.
So executing the miners might make the cause even more popular?
Exactly. So if Hotham had understood political history and he was educated enough that he might have recognized that mercy and reconciliation would actually consolidate his authority more effectively than brutality.
But he could also argue law and order matter. The rule of law must be upheld. People cannot take up arms against lawful authority without consequences.
A fair point. Law and order do matter, But the question becomes, what is lawful authority? If the authorities are unjust, if they're engaging in corruption and denying democratic participation, do citizens have a right to resist? That's a philosophical question that goes back to political theorists like John Locke.
What would John Locke say?
Locke argued that when government violates people's natural rights, they have the right to resist. They have the right to seek better governance. So there's a legitimate philosophical argument that the miners were engaged in civil disobedience, resistance to unjust authority.
So Hotham's real choice was between crushing dissent through harsh punishment and addressing the underlying causes of the dissent through reform.
Exactly. Governor Hotham made his choice.
What did he do?
He pursued harsh prosecution. The 13 miners, later 14 when additional arrests occurred, were charged with high treason. They were going to be tried in the Supreme Court of Victoria.
But the trials didn't go as planned?
The trials revealed that Hotham had fundamentally miscalculated. Starting in February 1855, the accused rebels were brought to trial one by one.
Who judged them?
Who judged them? Juries. 12 ordinary citizens, selected from the community. And here's what happened. The first defendant was tried before a jury of Melbourne property owners. The jury deliberated for approximately 30 minutes.
30 minutes?
30 minutes. And they returned a verdict of not guilty.
They acquitted him just like that?
Just like that. And when the defendant emerged from the courthouse, a crowd estimated at 10,000 people had gathered outside. They literally carried him through the streets on their shoulders, celebrating him as a hero.
They were treating him like a hero, not a criminal.
Treating him like a hero. And the judge, the Chief Justice, was so disturbed by the crowd's applause and support that he rebuked it from the bench. He actually sentenced 2 people to 1 week's imprisonment for contempt of court, for trying to influence the jury through applause.
The judge was that upset?
The judge understood that the trial was becoming a political statement. The jury's verdict was a judgment not just on that individual defendant, but on the government's prosecution strategy itself.
What about the other trials?
The remaining trials proceeded with predictable inevitability. One jury after another acquitted the defendants. By the final trials, the judges themselves were becoming weary. The Chief Justice, Redmond Barry, was so frustrated that he wrote in his notes, the trials had become weary, stale, flat, dull, and unprofitable.
The judge actually wrote that?
The judge actually wrote it. He was frustrated because the jury system was working exactly as it was supposed to. The people were judging the government's case and finding it wanting.
So the trials became a referendum on the government's actions.
A referendum. And the verdict was clear. The people did not support the government's prosecution of these miners. And then, and this is crucial, Colonial Secretary Lord John Russell in London learned about the trials. Russell was the British Colonial Secretary. He reviewed what Hotham had done, and he sent an official rebuke.
A rebuke from Britain?
A formal rebuke. Russell essentially told Hotham, you overreached. You prosecuted for high treason when lesser charges would have been appropriate. You've damaged your own credibility.
So even the imperial authority in London thought Hotham had gone too far?
Even the imperial authority thought he'd gone too far. That rebuke effectively ended any possibility of renewed prosecutions. It was a diplomatic way of saying, the trials are finished. This is over. On May 9th, 1855, about 5 months after the assault, Governor Hotham declared a general amnesty. All persons involved in the Eureka Uprising, including Peter Lalor and other leaders still in hiding, were pardoned.
So they were all freed?
All freed, all amnestied. And that amnesty represented something profound. It represented the government's acknowledgement that the uprising, while militarily defeated, had been politically successful.
The miners lost the battle, but won the argument.
Precisely. The miners lost the battle, but won the argument. And that's what makes this story so remarkable. Peter Lalor, despite losing his arm, despite being prosecuted for treason, despite being in hiding, he lived to see democratic reforms he had fought for actually implemented. The Royal Commission of Inquiry into Goldfields Administration, which had been appointed before the uprising, completed its investigation in April 1855, and the Commission's recommendations were extraordinary.
What did they recommend?
They recommended abolition of the monthly mining license fee, the very fee that had caused such widespread suffering. They recommended replacing it with what was called the miner's right, a single payment of £1 annually that would grant voting rights to the holder.
They replaced an oppressive system with a voting right?
They created a mechanism through which miners could participate in democratic processes. The miners' right wasn't just about mining. It was about political participation. Holders could vote. They could have a voice.
So the government was buying off the rebellion with democratic representation?
In a sense, yes. But more importantly, it represented acknowledgement that the miners' demand for political participation was legitimate. It represented acceptance of the principle that ordinary working people deserved a voice in governance.
Did it work? Did other miners' areas follow the same model?
It didn't just work for miners. It spread throughout Victoria. By 1856, Victoria had introduced secret ballot voting, the Chartist demand. By 1857, Victoria had implemented universal male suffrage, another Chartist demand. By 1859, triennial parliaments were instituted.
Victoria became a democratic model?
Victoria became a democratic model. And the irony, the beautiful, painful irony, is that this happened while most of Britain itself didn't have universal male suffrage. Britain didn't achieve it until 1884. Victoria achieved it in 1857.
So Australia was ahead of Britain on democracy?
Australia was ahead of Britain on democracy. And this happened because miners, ordinary people, decided that they deserved a voice, and they were willing to fight for it. Peter Lalor didn't retreat into obscurity after the amnesty. He remained active politically. He was elected to the Victorian Legislative Assembly. He served representing South Grant from 1859 to 1865, and again from 1870 to 1889.
He went from being a rebel to being a politician?
He went from being a rebel to being a politician. And he lived to see the democratic institutions that he and his fellow miners had fought for become established, permanent features of Australian governance. He died on February 9th, 1889, having lived to see history validate the choices he and his comrades made on that dawn in December 1854.
And he lived his whole life with one arm?
He lived his whole life with one arm. That permanent injury, that constant physical reminder, it never seemed to diminish his commitment to the causes he believed in.
What about John Basson Humphrey, the man who wrote the Reform League's charter?
John Basson Humphrey lived until 1891. He participated in the trials, he testified before the investigations, and his testimony was crucial in documenting the miners' grievances and establishing that their cause was legitimate. After Eureka, Humphrey's life evolved differently than Lalor's. He became involved in journalism and political advocacy, but his transformation from radical agitator to establishment figure was more pronounced.
Did he eventually feel like the movement had been betrayed?
That's a question historians debate. Some believe he felt vindicated. His principles, as articulated in the Reform League's charter, became the foundation for Victorian democracy. Others suggest he felt the movement was partially co-opted, that workers' interests were served but not comprehensively.
What do you think happened?
I think the truth is complex. Yes, democratic reforms came. Yes, voting rights were extended, but women still couldn't vote. That took until 1908 in Victoria, and economic inequality continued. So was Eureka a triumph? Yes. Was it also incomplete? Also yes.
So real history is messier than simple victory stories?
Real history is messier than simple victory stories, but that doesn't diminish what those miners accomplished. They established a precedent. They showed that when ordinary people organize collectively and make their voices heard, authorities must listen. I've been telling you throughout this episode about the battle and the aftermath, but there's one person I mentioned early on whose true importance we haven't fully explored. Remember when I mentioned an unnamed woman who was killed during the assault?
Yes, the woman who was trying to help her wounded husband?
That woman. Her name was never recorded. She was never identified. She simply appears in one eyewitness account. A diary entry from someone named Charles Evans described as being mercilessly butchered by mounted troopers while she pleaded for the life of her wounded husband.
And we don't even know her name?
We don't even know her name. And for 170 years, historical accounts didn't mention her at all. The Eureka Stockade was remembered as a male rebellion. But women were there. This woman was there.
That's not fair. She died for the cause and nobody remembers her?
She died for the cause, and nobody remembers her. And that's where our unsung hero becomes not just one person, but many people. It's the three women who sewed the flag: Anastasia Hayes, Anastasia Withers, and Ann Duke. It's this unnamed woman. It's the women who brought supplies to the stockade. It's the women who tended the wounded.
The women whose contributions were erased?
Whose contributions were erased. and only in recent years, through the work of historians like Claire Wright, are we beginning to recover their stories. Claire Wright won the Stella Prize for her book, The Forgotten Rebels of Eureka, specifically because she devoted serious historical attention to these women's agency and participation.
So the real unsung hero is kind of all of them, everyone whose names we don't know?
Everyone whose names we don't know. The memorial at Eureka Stockade actually honors this. It says it honors the men and women whose names are unrecorded, alongside those whose identities were preserved. Because history remembers leaders, but history is made by mass participation.
Remember the names. Remember all of them.
Remember all of them. Remember Anne Duke sewing a flag while pregnant. Remember the unnamed woman who died trying to save her husband. Remember the 10,000 miners who gathered at Bakery Hill. Remember them. Now, the question becomes, how did this event occurring in a remote Australian goldfield have impact beyond Ballarat?
Did it have impact beyond Australia?
It had impact throughout Australia, first of all. News of the uprising and the miners' acquittals spread to other colonies. New South Wales heard about it. South Australia heard about it. The fact that ordinary citizens could challenge authority and emerge victorious, it was inspirational.
So other colonies copied the reforms?
Not exactly copied, but they were influenced. Victoria's rapid move toward democratic governance showed that reform was possible, and within the next few decades, all Australian colonies moved toward expanded suffrage and democratic representation. Australia became a leader in democracy globally.
So miners in Ballarat basically started a movement toward democratic governance across an entire continent?
In essence, yes. The Eureka Stockade became what we call a demonstration effect. It demonstrated that popular pressure could produce governmental change, and that had ripple effects across Australia.
But there's more to the story, isn't there?
There is more. Because Eureka became symbolically powerful, after the uprising, as Australian nationalism grew, particularly in the 1890s, the Eureka Stockade was reinterpreted.
Reinterpreted how?
It was reinterpreted as the birth of Australian democracy. Australian identity became linked to the idea of egalitarianism, the fair go for ordinary workers. The rebellion became the foundational myth of Australian democracy.
And the flag?
The flag became the ultimate symbol of that myth. When workers organized in the late 1800s and early 1900s, they carried the Eureka flag. When labor movements mobilized, they invoked Eureka. Even today, when Australians protest perceived injustice or challenge authority, they often reference Eureka.
So it's become this timeless symbol of resistance?
A timeless symbol. The Eureka flag flies at Labor Day celebrations in Australia. It's painted on murals. It's adopted by various political movements. In some ways, it's become a generic symbol of popular protest and democratic assertion. But here's something that fascinates me. That American author Mark Twain, you know him?
The guy who wrote about Tom Sawyer?
That Mark Twain. He visited Ballarat in October 1895, 41 years after the uprising. And he wrote something that became canonical in how we understand Eureka.
What did he write?
And I'm quoting Twain directly here. It was a revolution, small in size, but great politically. It was a strike for liberty, a struggle for principle, a stand against injustice and oppression. It is another instance of a victory won by a lost battle.
A victory won by a lost battle?
A victory won by a lost battle. That phrase, it captures the essence of Eureka perfectly. The miners were militarily defeated. The stockade was overrun. Some were killed. But politically, they were victorious. They achieved democratic reform. They changed Australian governance. They lost the battle, but won the war.
And that paradox is what makes the story enduring.
That paradox is what makes the story enduring, because it speaks to something fundamental about human nature and social progress. Sometimes, the people fighting against injustice are defeated in the moment, but their defeat becomes the seed of eventual victory. I want to share something that still moves me when I think about it. The last Byzantine emperor, that would be Constantine XI, who died defending Constantinople in 1453, was never found. His body was never identified. Somewhere in Istanbul, the last Roman emperor lies in an unmarked grave.
Wait, that's completely different from our story.
I know I got lost in another historical moment. Let me refocus on Eureka. Here's a fascinating fact about Eureka. The rebels chose a password to identify one another. The password was Vinegar Hill.
Vinegar Hill? Why that name?
Vinegar Hill is the site of a catastrophic Irish nationalist defeat during the 1798 Irish Rebellion. The rebels were defeated there. Their cause failed, and yet, 42 miners later, Irish miners in Australia chose that name as their password. They were invoking a failed rebellion to protect their current rebellion.
That's so powerful.
It is powerful. It shows that these miners understood they were part of a longer history. They understood they were continuing a struggle that went back generations. Irish resistance to oppression, Welsh working-class activism, German revolutionary ideals, Italian anti-papal sentiment. All of these traditions converged at Eureka.
So Eureka wasn't just an Australian event, it was an international event.
It was an international event. People from multiple nations, bringing their traditions and their hopes, created something new in Australian soil.
Niels, how did Eureka compare to similar movements in Asia? Like, were there miners' rebellions in places like China or Japan around the same time?
Excellent question, Ethan. The timing is interesting. In 1854, Japan was just being forced to open to Western trade. The American Commodore Perry arrived that very year. China was in the midst of the Opium Wars and the Taiping Rebellion. So there were massive social upheavals occurring in Asia simultaneously.
But were there similar mining-related rebellions?
Not precisely similar. Asian rebellions at this time tended to have more religious or cultural dimensions. The Taiping Rebellion was framed in religious terms, but the underlying cause was similar: people resisting external authority and economic exploitation. And yes, there would have been labor uprisings in China related to mining and industrial exploitation during this period.
So it was a global moment of workers and ordinary people pushing back?
A global moment. 1854 was a year of ferment. People across the world were saying, "We deserve a voice. We deserve representation. We deserve justice."
In Scotland, we have our own history of workers' movements and resistance to authority. The clearances had displaced people from the Highlands just decades before Eureka, so there's something universal about this impulse to resist and to demand fairness.
Universal. That's exactly right, Celine. Across continents, across cultures, across economic systems, when people face injustice, they organize, they resist, they demand change. Eureka is just one example of that universal human impulse. As we close today, I want to make sure we remember the people who made Eureka what it was. Remember Peter Lalor, the engineer who became a leader, who lost his arm for his principles, and who lived to see democracy established. Remember John Basson Humphrey, the Welsh law clerk, who articulated the philosophical foundations of democratic representation. Remember Anne Duke, sewing a flag while pregnant, creating a symbol that would endure for 170 years. Remember Anastasia Hayes and Anastasia Withers, women whose names are preserved, but whose individual stories are largely lost to history. Remember the unnamed woman who was killed defending her husband, who deserves to be remembered even though her name is unknown. Remember James Scobie, the Scottish digger whose death and the injustice that followed catalyzed the entire movement. Remember the 10,000 miners who gathered at Bakery Hill on that day in November. Remember the 113 who were arrested. Remember the 22 who died in the assault.
Remember them all.
Remember them all.
And here's something that might surprise you. The Eureka Stockade was militarily insignificant. The battle lasted 15 minutes. The fortification was hastily constructed and poorly designed. From a pure military standpoint, it was almost negligible.
But politically?
But politically, it was seismic. It established a precedent that would shape democracy not just in Australia, but across the world. It demonstrated that when ordinary people organize collectively and make their voices heard, when they're willing to stand together despite tremendous odds, authorities must listen.
So even though they lost the battle, they really did win?
Even though they lost the battle, they really did win. They won in the way that matters most. They won the right to participate in democracy. They won the principle that ordinary people deserve a voice in governance.
The thing that strikes me most is the courage of these people. They had almost no chance of success. They knew the military odds were terrible, and yet they chose to stand together.
Chose to stand together. That's the essence of it. That's what the Southern Cross flag represented, a choice to stand together despite fear, despite uncertainty, despite knowing that some might not survive.
And that choice changed Australia?
That choice changed Australia, and it continues to influence Australia. Every time Australians invoke democracy, invoke workers' rights, invoke the fair go, they're drawing on the legacy of Eureka.
And even today, when people carry the Eureka flag at protests or rallies, they're channeling that spirit.
They're channeling that spirit. They're saying, like those miners 170 years ago, we believe our voices matter. We believe we deserve justice. We believe we deserve a say in the decisions that affect our lives. History is about understanding that the past is never truly past. The decisions made in 1854 by Peter Lalor and John Basson Humphrey and the 10,000 miners, those decisions created the Australia that exists today. Democratic representation, the principle that ordinary people deserve a voice, these are not abstract concepts. They're concrete realities that shape how people live.
So history really does matter?
History really does matter, because understanding where we came from helps us understand who we are, and understanding how previous generations fought for the rights we now take for granted. Understanding it deeply. It should inspire us to protect those rights and to extend them further.
Remember the names. Remember what they fought for.
Remember the names. Remember that democracy wasn't inevitable. It wasn't given to us. It was fought for. It was bled for. And it requires each generation to defend and extend it. Today, we learned about an uprising that shouldn't have succeeded but did. We learned about miners who demanded democratic participation and wouldn't accept no for an answer. We learned about an iconic flag that became a symbol of resistance. We learned about Peter Lalor and the price he paid for his principles. We learned about unnamed women whose contributions were erased but are now being remembered. We learned that sometimes the greatest victories come through apparent defeats.
And we learned that Australia's path toward democracy wasn't inevitable. It came through struggle. It came through people standing together and demanding change.
And we learned that when ordinary people organize and take risks for something they believe in, that can actually change history.
Precisely, Ethan, precisely. As we close, I want to say this one more time, slowly and clearly. Remember Peter Lalor. Remember him not just as a name in a history book. Remember him as a man who made a choice to lead, a choice to stand, a choice to fight for something larger than himself, a choice that cost him his arm, but that gave Australia democracy.
Remember him.
Remember him.
Remember all of them. Remember Eureka. And so, as we finish today, I remind you, until our next journey through time, keep history alive. Keep it alive by remembering the people who fought for what you now have. Keep it alive by defending the principles they established. Keep it alive by understanding that democracy requires participation. Your participation in every generation. Until our next journey through time, keep history alive.
Next week, we're staying in this region, Australia and the Pacific, but jumping forward in time.
How far forward?
To 1913, a place called Gallipoli, and an event that would shape Australian identity in ways the diggers themselves didn't anticipate.
Thousands of young Australians, many of them descendants of the Eureka miners, would travel across the world to fight in a war, and one battle would become central to Australian identity.
What battle?
A battle so significant that every year since, Australians pause to remember it. It's called Gallipoli, and we'll explore it next week. The courage, the tragedy, the legacy.
Join us next episode for Gallipoli, when soldiers became immortal.
Until then, keep history alive.